Hi, everyone. This is Counseling 4500, Chapter 4, Psychoanalytic Therapy, Part 2. All right, now we're going to talk about the development of personality. It's important to realize that a lot of the things that he talks about is talking about early development. The psychosexual stages and the psychosocial stages of development are birth through adulthood. His stuff is usually the first 6 years are like the real big focus, but it goes to like to 12 years old as well, depending on which book you're using to study about Freud. But the three that we want to talk about when it comes to the psychosexual stages are the oral, the anal, and the phallic stage. You might have heard these things referenced, in movies or in conversation. But here is where it all came from, basically. So, aura stage is the inability to trust oneself and others, which result in fear of loving and forming close relationships and having low self esteem. So, we talked a little bit about this in class already, which is kind of oral stages associated with oftentimes breastfeeding, right? And whether or not you were properly breastfed could lead to certain types of, let's say, oral fixations, such things as smoking, drinking, or talking a lot. Those are considered things that are very related to the mouth. And part of that is because, were you properly breastfed when you were a child and stuff like that. So as we talk about this thing right there, then now you start to realize that women play an interesting role in Freud's life. And oftentimes in his generation as well, women were blamed for a lot of things, were seen as almost like, not equal to men. So in that sense, you can sort of see like, if the baby was not properly breastfed, most likely it's the mother's fault, right? And that's kind of something that modern day people have said, oh, that's not right. That's not appropriate, because that's blaming the mother for all of the things that happen to a person. All right, now let's go to the anal stage. The anal stage is the inability to recognize and express anger, leading to the denial of one's own power as a person, no sense of autonomy. So, autonomy is just a really fancy word for being able to do things on your own, right? So, anal stage is often connected to potty training, okay? So, when a baby is first learning how to go to the bathroom, oftentimes it's really messy, right? Kind of stinky, kind of messy, and stuff like that. And so, how was a child treated during that period? Were they scolded by their parents quite a bit, or maybe the mother, right? Like as we said before, we're really focusing on the women's, the mother who's raising the child. Did she yell at the child so much that the child now becomes very, very anxious about all this stuff? So as they grow up, they might become super neat freaks or super clean minimalist people. They don't want anything around. Or it could be someone who's really messy and kind of, kind of like, what is it called? Kind of like you are a hoarder of some sort, right? So those are potential results from what had happened when you were a child. The phallic stage is really a huge part. Women in today's world, also men as well, will say that this is also very sexist or misogynistic, and it shows you really how men are valued much more than women. So during the phallic stage, it's the inability to fully accept one's sexuality and sexual feelings and accepting oneself as a man or a woman. But really it does focus quite a bit on the woman. So imagine two little kids when they're children and they're young and they might see each other naked, right? And then the girl might go, how come you have something right there and I don't? So there's a sense of missing a part of you and wanting to have it. So this is why women might grow up to be very upset or needy or something like that, is a kind of a reaction to realizing that women do not have penises, basically. And that's where the word penis envy comes from, and so forth and so on. And again, like I said before, Freud is the founding father, right? But a lot of the more modern stuff that we're talking about really does react against some of the things that he has said. So fewer and fewer people are actually doing Freudian therapy in today's world. There are some still, obviously. However, a lot more people are less focused on the women's faults or anything like that, and more about, let's say, society and also just what your brain is thinking about. So if the child's needs are not met during these stages, the child may become fixated at that stage and exhibit those behaviors in later life. And then we're going to talk a little bit about Erikson next, where it talks about the fact that, other people have taken his ideas, but kind of expanded it and changed it. So let's go into that one next. So the next part is Erikson's psychosocial perspective. You might have heard of Erikson because his stuff is often talked about in lifespan or child development. And we'll go into the next slide where there's a chart we can look at. But anyways, so Erikson studied under Freud and then expanded it by talking about psychosocial aspects, psychological and social tasks that each child needs to master from infancy to old age. So from here, Erikson has already expanded from birth to about 6 or 12 years old to birth until death now instead. Development occurs throughout life and divided into these things called crises and their resolutions. So there's a couple of vocabulary words here. In psychology, whenever you hear the word development or to develop, that is talking about lifespan. Okay, it's not growing. That's what really it means. Okay. And then crises are kind of like, oh no, what's happening at this moment? But it doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing. Okay. A crisis is just an incident, a time in someone's life where now we need to make a decision to move forward with our lives. Okay. So let's talk about that next. So crisis. Turning point in life, do we move forward or do we go back to a previous stage because it is more easy to deal with? So for example, let's say you graduate high school, right? So what do you do with your life now? For some of us, we're like, I don't know. And then you kind of maybe just live at home and that's it. You don't really do anything. But for some other people, they might go, you know what? I'm going to go find work. And then that can be very, very scary, right? So you can go out and search for work and then you start working. And then for other people, they're like, you know what, maybe I'm going to go to school. So then now they have to decide what they're going to major in. So all those things can be very anxiety provoking, right? And very scary. But these stages are asking you, deal with it. Right? So how do you stay at home and kind of stay you don't progress any further? Are you going to go to work or are you going to go to school? Which are typically the options that you have. Yeah. And then another crisis might be, do you want to get married and settle down and have children? Right? That might be two major crises right there. And then so forth and so on. You can think about those. And so we can kind of stay back or move forward. Sometimes, we stay back for a little bit, then we move forward. Sometimes we move forward, then we stay a little bit back. So again, everyone's life is so different and unique. But we want to check in to see if they're making those milestones or not. Okay. Classical psychoanalysis is in psychology. Instincts and intrapsychic conflicts are the basic factors shaping personality and development. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking to you all right now about Freud. That was kind of the classic stuff. Today, in the modern world, we call it contemporary psychoanalysis. So it's much more ego psychology about, how are we supposed to behave in this world. Does not deny the id. So we're not pretending that it doesn't exist, but we emphasize the striving of the ego for mastery and competence. So you are still trying to be a great person, right? In today's world, we don't necessarily focus so much much on the id and stuff like that. But, again, this is why I think Freudian therapy is not as popular today, although, again, some people still use it because it doesn't necessarily fit with the way that we see the world in, let's say, in the 2024, right? All right, so here are the comparisons between Freud's psychosexual stages and Erikson's psychosocial stages. As you can sort of see the differences and then also the comparisons. So with oral stage, anal stage, phallic stage, latency stage, genital stage, and genital stage continues is similar to infancy, early childhood, preschool age, school age, adolescence, young adulthood, but then Erikson goes into middle age and then also later in life. So I'm not going to go much further than that. Please feel free to look into it in the textbook. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the therapeutic process, the therapeutic goal. So in Freud, what are we trying to do, right? It is to increase adaptive functioning through the reduction of the symptoms and resolutions of conflict. So what that means is we're learning how to cope with the life that we have, right? by reducing some of the things that make us, let's say, feel very anxious or very upset or scared or confused or, whatever it is. So basically making the unconscious conscious. So you understand why you're doing these things. So the two goals are, number one, to make the unconscious conscious. And then number two, strengthen the ego so that the behavior is based more on reality than cravings or the guilt. So strengthen the ego. So making, how you should behave in society more than just getting the id, which is like having fun and that's it. Or, being so scared of the world because of the moral component, feeling guilt all the time. Childhood experiences are reconstructed. So in Freudian therapy, you're going to look into your childhood quite a bit. You're going to discuss it. You're going to also interpret it as a therapist. And then you're going to analyze these things with your client. All right, now the therapist's function and role. So what does the therapist do in therapy? They come from a blank screen approach, which is an anonymous stance. Little amount of self-disclosure and also encouraging a transference relationship. Think about let's say a blank screen, right? There's nothing on it. Whatever is shined onto that screen is what you see. So what we say is that that's the client putting it on you, reflecting it on you. Okay. And the reason why you saw, like, even in the commercial and when you look at his office, you'll realize that the client usually is laying down and looking away from the therapist because you want the therapist to kind of remain anonymous in that way. So that the client can be free to just say whatever was on their mind, treat you or talk to you in a specific way that you'll realize. Maybe they'll tell you that you remind them of their parent or their sibling or their partner and stuff like that. So then that helps you a little bit more. Okay. All right. So believing that if a therapist shares very little, whatever the client feels towards them is based on feelings that they have with important people in their past or in their lives. This may mean that they have unfinished business to address with the therapist. So that means if they feel like they have certain things that they need to tell their loved ones or their person in their lives, they can do it and practice with you so that they can then apply it over to the real world. This is to help clients to be able to love, to work, and to play, to achieve self-awareness, honesty, and more effective personal relationships. Handle anxiety in a realistic way, gain control over impulsive and irrational behaviors, require a lot of interpretation, uncovering of the unconscious. So that's what you're going to do. So you're going to take notes, and then you're going to help them interpret and understand their motivations that are underneath them, right? Pay attention to the client's resistances. Resistances in psychology is when someone is preventing themselves from doing something or stopping themselves from doing something. So maybe you guys are talking about your family, but they won't talk about their father. They'll talk about everyone else, but not their father. And so we can go, I notice that you are not talking about every member of your family. Is there a reason why? Or, depending on how you talk to your clients, basically that's what we're trying to figure out. Are there gaps and inconsistencies in the stories? So they're telling you this big old story, but suddenly some of the details don't make sense or are missing. So you want to bring those things potentially up, because why are they avoiding those things? Infer meanings from dreams and free association. So understanding, or maybe trying to get an understanding of your dreams. And also, why did you talk about the certain things that you talked about in therapy? Feelings towards the therapist, again, kind of applies to what we were talking about before with the blank screen approach, which is this idea of transference. In therapy for Freud, he does encourage transference, which is the client treating the therapist or talking to the therapist like someone in their lives. So it's almost a way for them to practice maybe, and then allows the therapist to kind of understand them a little bit better as well. Okay. Now let's talk about the client's experience in therapy. In classical psychoanalysis, it's very long-term. Usually what I've been told is it's almost like lifelong. So the people who go to therapy back in the olden days with Freud were pretty well off, pretty wealthy, and typically women as well. Lie on a couch for free association, say whatever's on their mind. Feelings, experiences, associations, memories, fantasies. So they're going to share all those things or talk about all those things. Client does not see the analyst's face, like we talked about before, because if the client can see that you might be bored, or maybe it happens that you yawn, right? So now your client is affected by it and thinking like, oh, am I boring or whatever? So then they might become more performative for the therapist, and we don't want them to do that. We want them to be honest, humans, whoever they are. And sometimes in therapy, you're like looking at the clock, and then you don't want that to influence your client because they're like, oh, is it time up? Do I need to talk faster? Do I need to stop? Or whatever. So that becomes a reason why you don't necessarily see it. But in today's world, whenever you do therapy, you're usually looking at their faces. So this is very different, right? Like we said, this is classical psychoanalysis. Free to express any ideas, no censorship. Analysts, no judgment, asking questions, making interpretations, and then allowing for the client to regress into their childhood. So to go back into their childhood to recall these memories or ideas and stuff like that. All right, here is a picture of Freud's office. Isn't that interesting? And we talked a little bit about this in class already. Some of you all think that this is kind of gross and dusty looking and kind of like stuffy. Well, some of you guys might go, this is kind of nice and cool and comfortable, right? So again, I think the aesthetic, the look of the vibes of it back then was that it was supposed to be very comforting and inviting. All right, psychodynamic therapy, shorter therapy. So this is the more contemporary psychoanalysis, more contemporary Freudian. Is shorter therapy, does not use all the techniques from classical psychoanalysis, encouraged not to make major life changes during therapy so that it keeps your defenses loose. So we're not forcing them to change all these things, but we're letting them understand who they are, understanding of any major things that they were not aware of before, making it again conscious from the unconscious. And it is face-to-face. We're no longer looking away from the therapist. Both people agree to terminate their sessions when they both agree that the symptoms and the core conflicts are understood. So that means accepting your emotional problems, see historical root to these issues, so where it came from, your childhood basically, master your core themes, insight into how the environment affects them and how they affect their environment. So their society, they exist in a society. How do they fit into this whole thing? Reduce defensiveness. So remember those ego defense mechanisms, to not do those as much anymore, or at least keep it long term anyways. And then integrate awareness of the past problems with present relationships. So now you know why you have the relationships that you have, the way that you behave with certain people, potentially is from your past, and that's why it is here today. All right, relationship between the therapist and the client. In classical psychoanalysis, you kind of stand out of the relationship with the therapist. So you're not necessarily friends, right? Or you're not necessarily working together. There's a power dynamic that we both recognize, which is that the therapist is, the one with the keys, the answers to interpretation for the client. But contemporary psychodynamic therapy develops a relationship with the client. So again, in today's world, even if you are doing Freudian, most likely you are working with them as a team. Okay, focuses on the here and now as well as the past. So we talked a little bit about transference earlier. So transference, again, just to remind you, is the client's unconscious shifting of the analyst of feelings and fantasies that are reactions to significant others in their client's past. So that's just a lot of words basically saying is the client is going to look at the therapist and go, you remind me of someone. They might not necessarily say that explicitly out loud, but you'll get it because you as a therapist have not revealed a lot, yet they are talking to you in a certain way, right? Like a father figure, a mother figure, or something like that. And that kind of shows how, or for at least the therapist to see how they kind of talk to people, let's say within that specific type of power in their own lives. So they're believing that means that there's a repetition of the past and the present because they're talking to you in a specific way that they normally talk to you, that pattern. For change, transference must be worked through exploration of unconscious materials and defenses. So if they do want to work on it, then that's when you start to analyze and talk to them and then, basically interpret what's going on with how they talk to you and then move forward from there. Counter transference is the opposite. That is when the therapist responds in irrational ways loses objectivity in the relationship because their own conflicts are triggered. So now it's the other way around. So that means, let's say you are the therapist and your client is acting really bratty and reminds you of your younger sister, right? So then you start to find yourself actually talking to your client almost like you're talking to your little sister. And that may be the tone of voice or something like that. And typically that's not something that we want you to do when it comes to therapy, is because that means that you're focusing on your own problems, or you're dealing with your own problems, or trying to deal with your own problems. And that's not the point of therapy with your client, right? It's really about your client. But sometimes we are triggered that way. So we need to be aware of that so that we don't necessarily continue doing those things.